There's a shop in Westchester where the lift is never empty. Lotus, Caterham, Porsche, Ferrari. Cars that most mechanics turn away. Waldir's clients bring them here specifically because no one else touches them the same way. Everyone knows his name. Most of them have been coming for decades. He arrived in New York with one bag, 6 weeks of money, and almost no English. Today, his shop has a wait list, and every single one of those clients found him the same way, through word of mouth, because someone told them if it's a Lotus, there's only one guy to call. This story is how that happened. Welcome to Throttle Culture, a space where design, history, and emotion meet horsepower. We celebrate the stories behind the build and the people who see more than just a car. They see a connection. My name is Jay, and this week we're diving deep on a mechanic who crossed an ocean on a dream, built a life with his hands, and found his language in some of the most demanding machines ever engineered. This is part one of Waldir's story, so let's get into it. Waldir arrived in New York during a brutal winter in the 1980s with a single bag and a name that Americans immediately mispronounced. He was 25 years old. He spoke almost no English. And he had enough money to last perhaps 6 weeks if he was careful. But none of that seemed to register as a problem. To understand why, you have to go back, way back, into a city in the highlands of Brazil, a shop on the edge of town, and a boy who learned to read machines before he learned to read people. There are mechanics, and then there are people who have made the machine their life's language. Waldir is the second kind. Over decades of working on some of the most demanding, unforgiving, and beautifully engineered cars ever built, such as Lotus, Caterham, Porsche, Ferrari, machines where every engineering decision is load-bearing and nothing hides behind excess, he has developed something that's genuinely rare. And it's not just skill, but fluency. The ability to listen to a car the way a doctor listens to a patient. To understand not just what's wrong, but why. To set up a car not by spec sheet, but by feel, by logic, by a philosophy of mechanical honesty that he has spent a lifetime refining. He's not after those horsepower numbers. He's chasing balance. Cars leaving his hands neutral, predictive, communicative, and reliable. Drivers come back to him saying the same thing over and over. The car finally makes sense. That reputation was not handed to him. It was built, one machine at a time, across cities and continents, starting with almost nothing. Poços de Caldas sits in the highlands of Minas Gerais, in southeastern Brazil, at an elevation that keeps it cooler than the coast and ringed by the low mountains of the Serra da Mantiqueira. It's a city of thermal springs and red volcanic soil, of coffee farms that stretch up hillsides in improbably neat rows, of afternoons that arrive slow and golden, and evenings that drop suddenly into a chill that surprises people who expect all of Brazil to be hot. The city had a European quality to it, the architecture of Portuguese settlers, the ghost of a spa culture that had once drawn healthy visitors from Sao Paulo and Rio to soak in the mineral waters. By the time Waldir was born there in 1956, that era had mostly passed, but the town retained a certain dignity. There were tree-lined promenades. There was a central square where the old men gathered in the evenings and children ran circuits around the fountain until their mothers called them home.
Being born and growing up in Poços was really fun. We were born on the poor side of the town, so, all Italians, everybody knew each other. Yeah. All the families knew each other. So it basically was like a, close community, close but very tight together. Everybody was basically like blue collar, working factories and like glass mills, brick factories, okay, iron works, and a lot of places for the kids to play. No, there was no park back then. There was one school, okay, which was set up by the fathers over here from the United States. They treat us very well, okay. A Catholic church, they set up a nice school for the kids, all for free, doctors, everything. So we had it made, okay. Not a lot of money, but we had made. Everybody worked.
The air smelled of eucalyptus and wood smoke, and on certain mornings, faintly of sulfur from the springs beneath the earth. The landscape surrounding the city was the landscape of his childhood imagination. The Cerrado, that vast, ancient Brazilian savanna, softened here into something greener and more vertical. There were waterfalls tucked into the hills. There were farms where the workers started before dawn and the tractors moved in the early mist like slow animals, red dust rising behind their wheels. There were roads that had been cut through rock, roads that wound between ridges and dropped suddenly into valleys where the light collected differently, where the air was noticeably cooler and damp. It was a place that rewarded attention. You had to look at it carefully to understand it, because it didn't announce itself. Waldir and his brother had a shop that sat at the edge of the city, where the paved roads gave way to packed red dirt and the farms began in earnest. It was a long, low building with a corrugated iron roof that amplified the rain into something thunderous and made the dry season heat unbearable by midday. There were 2 bays, an ancient hydraulic lift that worked when it felt like it, and a smell that Waldir would carry with him for the rest of his life. Oil and iron, and the particular sweetness of diesel that has been burning for a long time. The farmers came from all directions. They came in the early morning when the mist was still on the hills and the roads were quiet, riding or driving whatever had been broken down or was about to. They were serious men with serious problems. A machine that failed at planting time was not an inconvenience, it was a crisis. The shop existed to solve those crises, and Waldir's brother understood this with the gravity that shaped everything about how he worked. Slowly, carefully, without drama, and getting it right. Waldir grew up alongside those machines, not as a student of them, not at first, simply as a child who was always nearby, who handed tools before being asked, who watched the way his big brother's hands moved with the patience that seemed impossible in a grown man. He learned to read a room by reading the machines in it. A tractor that had been running hard smelled different from one that had been sitting. An engine that had been abused had a sound underneath its idle that you felt more than heard. A faint instability, like something not quite in agreement with itself. These were not lessons anyone gave him. They were things that accumulated the way knowledge does when you spend your childhood in the presence of something demanding and real. But the machines that truly captured Waldir's imaginations were not the tractors and farm equipment in his brother's bays. They came to him in magazine pages, British publications he'd find at the stands in town, full of cars that looked built not for function, but for the pure, unreasonable joy of going fast. Formula One was a world away from Poços de Caldas, and yet it pulled him with a gravity he couldn't explain and never tried to. It was part of why the shop existed at all. 2 brothers who loved machines, one who found his answer in the red dirt of Minas Gerais, and one who was still looking.
So the first F1 car I saw was in 1969. Okay, so I was 13 years old in São Paulo, in Interlagos. It was not even, they were testing the track to see if it was, good for a Formula One, because the first Formula One race was in 71. So in 69, they were testing. So that's when the first I saw was a Matra, French Formula One. Wow. So after that was all history. And then after that, I really became, because at the time Lotus was the big thing in any sport. So I started following Lotus, and then from there, the next British car that I kind of start following was Jaguar because of the E-Type and all that thing. And then then the other British cars. That's it. It's like it became like a passion. Oh, I started in Brazil because I had to read car magazine every month. I could not wait the beginning of the month when they release in the newsstands. So I go by and read and all these things. Okay, me and my friend Claudio, we were the first ones from Poços and the surrounding areas to go see Formula One. Yeah, then we start bringing other people. Yes, okay, yeah, okay. Back then there was no seats, so the race was held on January, which summer, I mean, was hot like you couldn't believe it. And everybody, there were no seat. Whoever got in first, got a good spot to watch it. You better hang on to your life over there because you grab on a fence and, make, I don't know, some kind of, you grab your friend's hand together, or they pull you out. And it was like a really savage thing.
Yeah.
And when it rains, it was mud, that sticky mud, okay? We didn't have a tent or nothing. All right, we didn't stay in motels or not. What we did is we brought like a tarp, and there's this big avenue. It's like 6 lanes avenue, 3 and 3, and a garden in the center, right, to divide. So we used to make a tent over there. We buy a lot of liquor and cigarettes, okay? And that's where we slept, okay? Right next to the gate, because the gates for the track the race back then was held about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but like 9 o'clock, they were jammed up. The gates were jammed up. So we got up early in the morning, held everybody together, and as soon as you opened, it was like a stampede. I mean, I'm talking about maybe thousands of people were pushed to everybody. Even the police say, move around, let the people go, okay? The last time we went, it was going to open at 12, and we were at a whole bunch of people at the gate, and I was holding my little brother's hand. I said, hold on tight, okay? And my friend, Claude, this was like 2 hours before the gate. He started to yell, the gate is opening, they are opening the gates. I swear to God, I remember exactly, like a stampede of people. In the day, I grabbed my brother, I pulled, he fell, but we dragged him. He left sandals behind because they were going to stomp in him, okay? So we dragged him across. Come on, let's go. Yeah, that's how wild it was, okay?
He could not have explained the feeling precisely, even now. It was something about the proportion of those machines, the way they sat low and wide and seemed to be crouching even at rest. The way their lines had been drawn by someone who thought beauty and speed were in the same argument. An F1 car he saw in a magazine while sitting at home in the highlands of Minas Gerais was as distant from his life as the moon, and yet. He goes to Interlagos, both times in his beat-up Beetle, the one with the cut springs and raked nose that sat too low for comfort on the long stretches of bad road between Poços de Caldas and São Paulo. But he drove it anyway. On the first trip, he blew a rear tire somewhere outside of Campinas at 2 a.m. and changed it by the light of a cigarette lighter, crouched in the dark on the shoulder while trucks shook the air around him. He wouldn't have traded a minute of it. The races were in January, the Brazilian Grand Prix settling into its slot at the start of the season in those years. Interlagos in the early 70s was not a comfortable place to watch a race. The facilities were provisional at best. The crowds were enormous and entirely ungoverned. And the noise was something that lived in your chest for days afterward. He stood as close to the track as they would let him, which was closer than they should have, and watched machines he had only ever seen in soft page magazines come through the Curva do Lago at speeds that seemed to belong to a different physics than the one he'd grown up with. He remembered the turbos arriving and changing everything. That era when the cars began to sound less like engines and more like something barely contained. A violence under pressure. He remembered the Renaults with their big turbo lag and their sudden savage surge, and the way the crowd responded to Piquet, a Brazilian in contention for the championship, with a fervor that was almost religious. He remembered a moment on the second trip in 1982, the year the racing was as chaotic as anything he'd ever seen, when he was standing near the pit straight and a car came through so fast and so low that his mind genuinely refused it for a second, the way eye refuses a magic trick before the brain catches up. And he stood there thinking, someone built that. Someone's hands made that possible. The thought didn't humble him. It did something closer to the opposite. The drive back was always the harder one. 8 hours in a car with the sound still living in his chest, and Sao Paulo shrinking in the mirror, and Poços de Caldas getting closer with every kilometer. The shop would be there in the morning. The same engines, the same customers, the same good, honest work that he had learned to love and had quietly, carefully began to outgrow. He knew both times that he was driving back to something he was also driving away from. He just didn't know yet how far away it would eventually take him. By the time he was 19, that dream had taken on specificity. He was going to go somewhere that had those cars, and he was going to work on them. He didn't know exactly where yet or how. He knew only that the shop on the edge of Poços de Caldas, for all the love he had for it, was not where that story ended. It was where it started. New York was the answer in the way that New York was the answer for a generation of young men who needed the world to be bigger than the one they'd been born into. Waldir arrived during a brutal winter in the 1980s with a single bag and a name that Americans immediately mispronounced. He was 25 years old. He had crossed an entire continent on faith and stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and standing on a street corner in Westchester, the cold hitting him in a way no Brazilian winter ever had, he felt something close to joy. The machines here were everywhere, and they moved fast. They were loud and purposeful, and everywhere you looked, something was running. The early years were not glamorous. He worked at a car wash and slept there at night. He lived in that same car wash for 6 months and learned that loneliness in a foreign city is its own specific education, one that either breaks you or slowly, quietly makes you harder in the good sense of the word.
Yeah, I started in a car
Where
wash.
you used to sleep too.
Yes. I lived in a car wash for 6 months.
What you were washing normal
We were
cars,
washing
not-
police cars
Yeah,
and
yeah.
taxis, all the whatever. Was a really old. The car wash was really old. Was set up in was my age, 1956,
Wow.
and it used to break down a lot with cars inside. So we have to push cars out, and it was down in the hill. Many times cars just were flying from the inside. They forgot to put the car in neutral, I swear. But I across the street after the car wash. Well, this Italian guy, he bought the car wash maybe 3 or 4 months after I came here. And, I guess, I don't know, I guess was the destiny or whatever, because I'm Italian descendant, he's Italian, his mother not even spoke English, okay? So he bought a car wash. It was a gas station, car wash and gas station. And he fired everybody and he said to me, you stay.
Wow.
I said, I'm staying. He said, yeah, you stay. I said, okay, all right. So I not even had a place to sleep. I was sleeping over there. So he said, okay, you were staying, you hire I said, Gino, I don't speak English. I don't know nothing. The only thing I know is help, okay? Yeah. He said, you'll learn, don't worry, okay? So that's how it went.
About 1.5 years in, he goes back to Brazil. Not because New York had beaten him, not because the dream had dimmed. He went back because there was a woman, his girlfriend, who had stayed behind in Poços de Caldas when he left, who had waited with the particular patience of someone who believed in a person before that person had fully become what they were going to be. He married her. It was not a complicated decision. Some things he had always understood were not so complicated. Then he came back to New York, this time with a wife, and with the particular clarity that comes from having chosen something twice. The work continued. The English got better. The car wash gave way to better work, and better work gave way to the thing he had always been moving toward. After years of learning the specific grammar of American cars and American shops, the rhythms of it, the expectations, the difference between a customer who wanted something fixed and a customer who wanted to understand what had been fixed and why. So he opened his own shop.
Because I was only one mechanic and one helper, and one day he came up to me and said, you gotta produce $15,000 a week. I say, what, are you crazy? You know, I'm a one-man shop.
Yeah.
50. If I'm gonna do $15, I'm gonna do for me.
Right.
That's exactly what I told him. So I came home to have lunch. When I came back, my toolbox was on the sidewalk. Then I said to Simone, you know what? Let's open a shop for ourselves. The worst thing that can happen, we close now, go work for somebody else. That isn't right. That's all it can happen. So she found me a garage on the other side of town over here. It had no insulation. It had no heat. It had no running water, no nothing. It was a shed. She found, said, okay, let's do right here. And we start doing. My first customer was the owner of the property. Okay, yeah. Then people start to come and come. So we moved from there to over here, basically across the block over here. So we rented over there it was a 2-car garage. And then we started. When Lotus came back to the United States, well, Nicholas and Simone passed in front of the dealer.
Okay.
Was the Elise, the original Elise. And they came over to the shop, said, Nicholas said, you know what, I just saw it. They opened up a Lotus dealer in Portchester. I said, you kidding me? I said, okay. I said, I'm going there. So I go over there. They need a mechanic. I spoke with, the owner was David. I said, you hired, okay? And I stayed over there until a few months before Lotus closed them down because they were doing monkey business also. Okay, I guess I attract monkey business.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were buying cars from Lotus, not paying them. Actually, they came from England and shut them down.
Wow.
They could have been, I'm gonna say, billionaires because Michael Jordan, the guy who owns Warner Television, they were all our customers, okay? And actually, Michael Jordan had a Volkswagen bus, 10-window.
Oh, yeah.
At the time, worth more than $1 million, all original. It was all there. And we had Lamborghinis, Aston Martins, you name it, we had over there. And they blew it because they were doing shitty business, yeah. Yeah, then, when I left over there, we opened up and the people that used to bring the cars over there started bringing it to me. Yeah, that's it.
It was not a large operation, not at first, but it was his. A space where the work could be done the way he believed the work should be done. Carefully, honestly, and without shortcuts, without the small dishonesties that accumulate in shops where speed matters more than getting it right. The farmers of Poços de Caldas would have recognized the philosophy immediately. His brother would have recognized it. It was the same gravity, transplanted. The same conviction that a machine in your hands deserves your full attention because someone is depending on it. The shop was where it all began to come together. And it's where the cars that had existed only in magazine pages, the low, crouching, unreasonably beautiful machines, finally started arriving in his bay. A Lotus, then another, then the work that would define the rest of his life. He worked and lived in a car wash while eating canned beans, and then married the woman who waited and built something from nothing in a city that doesn't slow down for anyone. And now, finally, the machines were in front of him. Not in a magazine, not at Interlagos behind a barrier, in his own hands. That's where part 1 ends. Next week, we'll get into the Lotus itself, what makes it extraordinary, why it's nearly impossible to work on, and what Waldir learned from a car that punishes everything you don't understand about it. Colin Chapman's most famous line was simplify, then add lightness. And we're going to find out what that actually means when the car is on your lift and a customer is waiting. That's Throttle Culture. I'm Jay, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who gets it. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next one.